we're going to continue here in a second, but I want to kind of recap what we saw. Basically, literally the first fruits of this kingdom that Yah was establishing. We talked about it earlier, that Yahushua Messiah being the king himself, he appointed the 12. Basically, the number 12 has to do with kingdom authority. It has to do with government. And that's why they also selected another one to take the place of Yehuda. We also saw the 70, that basically Messiah was raising up the kingdom within Israel. We're going to look a little bit more because the kingdom that was in place was going to be rejected. This kingdom was being established. And in Acts 2, we see the first fruits, literally, of the kingdom coming together. The two sticks come together at first fruits, the two houses. Peter addressed the house of Yehuda, the house of Israel, the whole house of Israel. And notice that it says that they came together house to house. This is a sod-level teaching of the two houses came together. I don't know if you saw that in that last slide. It says house to house. They came together in Acts. And it's a very interesting sod-level teaching that the two houses were united. Now, it was just a remnant. It wasn't everybody. It was a small remnant within Israel, but this remnant was established at this point. We're going to keep coming back to the remnant today, but we're going to turn our attention to the first schism that took place. And this first schism is more kind of within the whole body of Israel that we kind of addressed a little bit last time, but we're going to look a little bit more closely at it. And it's the Judaic Schism. It's we're going to get into this a little bit. The Judaic means from pertaining to Jews and ancient Judaism, and schism basically means a division, meaning the remnant went one way and the schism went another way. This is according to Josephus in the Wars of the Jews, Book 2, Chapter 8, Paragraph 2. It is written there that, for there are three philosophical sects among the Jews. The followers of the first, which are the Pharisees, of the second, the Sadducees, and of the third, which pretend to a severer discipline, are called the Essenes. These last are Jews by birth and seem to have a greater affection for one another than the other sects have. And I'm not going to go into all of it, but there is a lot more information on each one of these. And there was many other sects as well. Like even with the Pharisees, there were 7 different groups of Pharisees. Kind of what we see today in Christianity. There's so many different flavors and churches of all different types. There was all these different sects. But what Messiah was doing was creating, we'll say, a righteous branch shooting out of Jesse from the stump. He was creating a way that he wanted people to go, and somewhat rejecting all these other different things going on. So there was actually, even though Josephus mentions these, I'm going to just mention another sect that was present as well. And we actually read about it in Acts, because Paul got accused of being a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarene, or the Nazarenes, as some versions have. But let's read just a few of these verses here. This is from Acts 24, verse 5. For having found this man a plague, who stirs up dissension among all the Yahudim throughout the world, and a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarene. They're accusing Paul basically of being an absolute plague, and a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarene. We're going to explain what this word Nazarene means here in a second, but I'm going to read a few more verses here. This next one's from Acts 28:22. And we think it right to hear, to hear from you what you think. For indeed, concerning this sect, we know that it is spoken against everywhere. And actually, the branch that Messiah, the righteous branch, was opposed on every side, actually, even though they were still growing and there was favor. Elohim's favor was on them. There was others in the secular realms that were against them, and religious as well, especially the Judaic Schism was against this righteous branch that was forming. In Jeremiah 31, verse 6, it is written, For there shall be a day when the watchmen, and that word there is Natsarim in the Hebrew, cry out on the Mount Ephraim, arise, and let us go up to Zion, to Yahuwah our Elohim. And this is a prophecy that's going to happen here very soon. There's watchmen on Mount Ephraim. Ephraim is scattered to the four winds. There will be watchmen, guardians, protectors that will say, "Arise and go up to Zion, to Yahuwah, return to Him." For the word "watchman" is the Hebrew word Natsarim. It means guardian, protectors, preservers. It means branches as descendants, and there's definitely a connection between Messiah's words as being the root and his students being the branches or the offsprings of his teaching. So the Natsarim are basically, Messiah was that branch or that vine, and they were attached to him, and they were following his teachings. That's who the Natsarim are. They're guarding the name, and they're guarding the Torah, basically, the teachings, the covenant. That's what they're doing. They're watching over it. And Messiah tells his disciples before he... in Matthew 28, verses 18 through 20, and Yahushua came up and spoke to them, saying, "All authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. Go therefore and make taught ones of all nations, immersing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and the set-apart Spirit, teaching them to guard all that I have commanded you. And see, I am with you always, even unto the end of the age." Notice the connection with teaching and guarding. The Natsarim are always guarding and protecting the covenant. Here's the endurance of the set-apart ones. Here are those guarding the commands of Elohim and the belief of Yahushua, Messiah, Revelation 14:12. Basically, watchmen stand watch. They stay up the latest. They're up the earliest. They're watching out. They're protecting. They're the brother's keeper. That word shamar, to keep, and watch and guard is very, very kind of interconnected. So let's look at, I said we're going to come back to Yehukanan, and we're going to look at what he was doing, because that Natsarim group that was branching out through Messiah and starting at the immersion of Yehukanan or John was opposed to the other sects. And we're going to kind of look at the differences here as we kind of walk through this. And if you turn to Matthew chapter 3, we're going to be there for a little bit looking at a few of these verses. Starting in verse 1 and 2. "And in those days, Yehukanan, the immerser, came proclaiming in the wilderness of Yehuda, saying, Repent, for the reign of the heavens has come near." And the word repent means to turn back. We need to turn back to Yahuwah and his ways. And the kingdom was coming near. Matter of fact, not only the kingdom was coming near, the very king of the kingdom was in their midst, and they didn't know it yet. And they needed to get things right. And this is what John was doing. He's breaking up the fallow ground. He was trying to prepare them. Continuing on, "For this is he who was spoken of by the prophet Yeshayahu, saying, A voice of one crying in the wilderness, Prepare the way of Yahuwah, make his path straight." Realize that John is actually preparing the way of Yahuwah. That's what the scriptures say. He's preparing the way of Yahuwah to make his path straight. You got to think about that one for a while. Continuing on, "Then in Jerusalem and all Yehuda and the country around the Jordan, which is the Jordan, went out to him, and they were immersed by him in the Jordan, confessing their sins." This is a quite interesting place that his ministry starts. And those familiar with the Torah, this is the entry point that the tribes came into the land. And you remember with Joshua, even when they were in the wilderness for 40 years, they crossed the Jordan. This is a very significant, they're crossing into the land. It's almost like kind of crossing that Red Sea again, and they're coming into covenant. Everything's happening. They're coming into the house of Yah, and they they set up stones as memorials. And here John is pointing Israel back to when they first entered the land. He's pointing them all the way back to the beginning. And we're going to continue reading here. And see, many of the Pharisees, these sects here again, and the Sadducees came to his immersion. And he said to them, "Brood of adders, who has warned you to flee from the coming wrath?" It's not a way to get converts. He's like basically calling them vipers, Bear therefore fruits worthy of repentance. Do not think to say to yourselves, we have Abraham as our father. For I say to you that Elohim is able to raise up children to Abraham from these stones. Remember, the stones gave witness to what was going on. A lot of people read this and don't realize, actually, John is prophesying something very immediate, not something at the end of the age, even though you can kind of maybe tie it into that. But notice that I kind of highlighted here where it says, flee from the coming wrath. There was something very soon coming to this group that did not want to listen to Messiah. This group that all these other sects, there was something very coming. We'll get into it here soon, but there was wrath coming. The axe is already laid to the root of the trees. Every tree then which does not bear good fruit is cut down and is thrown into the fire. I indeed immerse you in water unto repentance, but he who is coming after me is mightier than I, whose sandal I am not worthy to bear. He shall immerse you in the set-apart spirit and fire, and his winnowing fork is in his hand, and he shall thoroughly cleanse his threshing floor, and gather the wheat into the storehouse, but the chaff he shall burn with unquenchable fire. So what's going to happen is Messiah is going to bring his body into the storehouse, and the chaff, all these other groups are going to, basically sects are going to be burnt up. And that's actually going to happen in this in John's day, even though John's days were cut short. I just wanted to give a picture of what winnowing is, because a lot of people aren't familiar with what this means. Winnowing is kind of separating the wheat from the chaff, where people can throw up, this, and the wheat drops to the ground, but the chaff blows down, and you can basically, it's good for you, burn that, but gather up the wheat, and you can bring it in. So I wanted to, and I'm not sure if people know what those terms are, so there's some pictures to kind of maybe help. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, serpents, brood of adders. This is the same thing Yehukanan was saying to the Pharisees. How would you escape the judgment of Gehenna? We're going to talk about this Gehenna, what this means. And Gehenna means like lake of fire and ultimate judgment, but also it has something very immediate to them in this age, in that generation that they were in as well. Again, there's being a separation. The wheat from the chaff is being separated. For I say to you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you shall by no means enter the reign of the heavens. This is what Messiah said. And a lot of people read this and go, what? You know what I mean? They think that the scribes and Pharisees were actually keeping Torah. No, they weren't. Actually, that was the problem. They weren't keeping the Torah. And Messiah repeatedly says they weren't keeping the Torah and they were lawless. And he tells his followers, your righteousness must exceed theirs. Why? Because they weren't keeping it. And that's why they were going to be burnt up. But he said, this is Matthew 15:3. But he answering said to them, why do you transgress the commandments of Elohim because of your tradition? And this is all about, in Acts 15, they came to him and they were questioning him about the washing of hands, as the disciples were eating without washing their hands, which is a tradition of men. It's not in the Torah. And Messiah fires back, why do you transgress the commandments of Elohim because of your traditions? Basically challenging them. And he goes on also in Mark 7 and says kind of the same thing. Basically, they had set up additions and subtractions. Whenever you add to the Torah and you do add all these things, you're not going to be able to keep the original commands. And this is what they were doing. It was a violation of Torah. Deuteronomy 4:2 says, do not add or take away from the word of Yahuwah, that you may be able to keep his commandments. In Matthew 23:28, it is written, so you outwardly indeed appear righteous to men, but inside you are filled with hypocrisy and lawlessness. And in Matthew 23, Messiah just gives them takes off the belt and gives them a beating, literally. If you read through that, it's a woe to them. And he basically condemns everything they're doing. Say it's full of hypocrisy, that they're lawless, they're not keeping what they should be keeping. And we're going to look at maybe one other example later on. They were doing the less important parts of Torah and forgetting the weightier matters of the Torah. And that's something we're going to look at later. Because of this, because of that generation was so wicked, see, I send you prophets and wise men and scholars of Scripture. Some of them you shall kill and impale, and some of them you shall flog in your congregations and persecute from city to city. This is important. This next part is really important. Most people read this and never understand quite the implications. So that on you should come all the righteous blood shed on the earth. All the righteous blood shed on the earth. And listen what Messiah has to say. From the blood of the righteous Abel or Habel to the bloodshed of Zechariah the prophet, the son of Berechiah, who was murdered between the dwelling place and the altar. Truly I say to you, all this shall come upon this generation. I don't know if you understand what that means, but all the righteous bloodshed that had happened in the whole entire earth leading up to this event was getting ready to be poured out on this generation Messiah is talking about here in Matthew 23:34 through 36. And a lot of people miss this. This is very significant. The next scripture I'm reading from is Luke 21, verses 20 through 24. And when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its laying waste is near. Then let those in Yehuda flee to the mountains. Let those who are in the midst of her go out. Let not those who are in the fields enter her, because these are the days of vengeance, to fill what has been written. And woe to those who are pregnant and those who are nursing children in those days, for there shall be great distress in the earth and wrath upon this people, and they shall fall by the edge of the sword and be led away captive into the nations. And Jerusalem shall be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles until the time of the Gentiles are fulfilled. Messiah says these are the days of vengeance. But notice his warning there about when you see Jerusalem surrounded. And now we're going to get a little bit of the history here of what actually happened later on after Messiah's resurrection and years later leading up to what would be the destruction of the temple in 70 CE and ultimately being burnt and many people dying. As he said, the chaff would be destroyed and the wheat would be brought in the storehouse. Well, in history, this is actually what happened. And Messiah's instructions, and when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its laying waste is near, is quite interesting, because normally you would not wait for an army to surround a city to flee. But Josephus records a very interesting thing by a Roman general named Celsus, who literally took an army and in 66 CE surrounded the city of Jerusalem. Literally surrounded the city, and for no reason, apparently according to Josephus, he got up and left with his army. As a matter of fact, the Jews in that land followed after him and thought he was retreat. So they were kind of beating their army up as they were retreating. Well, this was the sign to get out of Dodge right here. Basically, get out of Jerusalem. It was an amazing sign. It's actually recorded in history for us that the city was surrounded and the army left, which is quite amazing. And remember Peter's words here at the bottom. Remember he said, be saved from this crooked generation. We're reading in there earlier from Acts. and I forgot to read one part at the top there. Let those in Yehuda flee to the mountains, and let those in the midst of her go out. That's what Messiah said. He said, once you see this, get out of there. Go to the mountains. Don't go back. Well, the remnant after James the Just, or Yehukanan HaZaddik, after he was killed, and I believe it's 62 CE. We're going to be looking at that here shortly. The early believers chose Simeon to lead the early group in Jerusalem, the congregation there. And it was through this group that basically left and fled to a place called Pella. And this is actually recorded in early church history by a historian named Eusebius. And although I don't agree with Eusebius on many things, he actually gives testimony that the early believers, especially those who from Jerusalem, were Torah observant, and he gives some very interesting insights. So it even makes it a stronger witness that he doesn't necessarily agree on keeping Torah per se, but he's giving witnesses that the early believers did. And he's giving witness to specific events that kind of line up with Scripture and give us a better understanding of what was going on at the time. So the remnant escaped to Pella before 70 CE, when this city was destroyed. So this is the wheat going into the storehouse. I'm going to read this quote here by Eusebius. This is found in his, Book 3, Chapter 5, Section 3, in his church history. The whole body, however, of the assembly of Jerusalem, having been commanded by a divine revelation — we just read it, that divine revelation, when you see the city surrounded, get out of there, by armies, given by men of approved piety, that before the war, removed from the city and dwelt in a certain town beyond the Jordan called Pella. There those that believed in Messiah, having removed from the city, as if holy men had retired entirely and abandoned the royal city itself and the whole land of Yehuda, the divine justice for their crimes against Messiah and his apostles finally overtook them, totally destroying the whole generation of those evildoers from the earth. This sounds very anti-Semitic, and even though we're going to see testimony from Josephus and other people, I don't think people actually understand how wicked the generation was that Messiah, when he was living. And some of those verses I mentioned earlier, it was so wicked that judgment of all the righteous bloodshed was going to come on that generation. That's how wicked it was. And that's why this very strong language is used, even though the church fathers are kind of anti-Semitic to begin with. I can understand why they're saying this here. I want to make one other point here. In this slide, Pella is actually in the Decapolis, the 10 cities that are south of the Sea of Galilee. And I don't know if you can see it on the map here. You may be able to see it. It's actually it's pointed out there for those who are here looking at this, that Pella is kind of south there, the location. If you get on the net and actually do a little bit of searching, it's actually quite interesting, some of the things there. Meanwhile, while the wheat was in the storehouse and they had plenty of food, everything was fine at Pella, and the remnant basically was there, well, Titus goes back to Jerusalem and totally destroys the place. I mean, totally surrounds the city. He puts the 10th Legion on Mount Olives. He surrounds the whole entire place. And Titus was such a nice guy. He invited, matter of fact, this happened during Passover. People that were visiting for Passover to keep the feast were coming in, and he trapped them in the city. That's why actually these large numbers of deaths were recorded. A lot of people were actually coming into the city for the feast, and he trapped them in and didn't let them out. And that would take it was a strategic strategy too, because it would eat up their food supply and water supplies by putting them in the city, the extras. So during these times, you can have influxes of enormous populations in the city, because some people don't agree with these numbers that we'll get into, how many people actually died during this. I'll just read a few of these. Titus completely sealed off Jerusalem from the rest of the world with a wall of earth. Anyone caught was crucified. As many as 500 people a day were crucified. And here's a quote by Josephus as well. The entire nation was now shut in as in prison, and the Roman army encompassed the city when it was crowded with inhabitants for Passover. According to the multitude of those therein, perished exceeded all the destruction that either men or Elohim ever brought upon the world. And this, when you read this, it sounds like it's an exaggeration of speech, but once you actually understand what happened, and the fact that the numbers I'm getting ready to share didn't have modern weaponry, this is astronomical. There's nothing like this that's ever happened. So you can see what Josephus is talking about. The Valley of Hinnom, or Gehinnom, is actually located on the southwest part of Jerusalem. I am very aware with this where this is at, because when I was in Jerusalem, I stayed on the east side of Jerusalem and literally walked down this area, kind of close to the Mount of Olives, and you can actually walk down the Kidron Valley all the way through there, the Valley of the Kings, and see where this area is at. But what happened was the leaders that were inside the city, once they were trapped in, had an argument over the food and started destroying the food within the city. Remember, I just said Titus trapped more people in the city to put pressure on the food. Then the leaders burnt the food that was in the city. I don't know what to say about that. That's just stupid. But anyways, what happened was a lot of horrible things. I'm not going to mention all of them, but cannibalism was one of the things that was happening. There was horrific events happening. People eating their children. They were starving to death. It got so bad, the people piled up inside the city. They started throwing the bodies over the wall, and it went down into the valley of Gehinnom. Remember Messiah said, how are you going to escape? How would you escape the judgment of Gehenna? He was talking to them that they were going to be judged. That generation was going to be judged. And they were trapped in, and we're going to talk about the numbers, how many died here in a second. But this is real things that happened during this time. During this generation that Messiah said, come upon this generation. And I'm going to read this quote by Josephus. Not enduring the stench of the dead bodies, they had them cast down from the walls into the valleys beneath. This is in Josephus. There's a lot of other quotes. Like I said, I'm not going to read them all because they're quite disgusting, but if you're interested in reading exactly what happened, I advise you to go look at The War of the Jews, Book 5, and you'll probably get a lot more information there. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, killing the prophets and stoning those who are sent to her. How often I wish to gather your children the way a hen gathers her chickens under her wings, but you would not. See, your house is left to you laid waste. For I say unto you, from now on you shall by no means see me until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of Yahuwah. Matthew 23, 37 through 39. Here we have Messiah prophesying that their house is laid waste. This is before his death. He said, your house is laid waste. And you remember there was a discussion after he got done scalding the Pharisees, woe to you, in chapter 23 of Matthew. His disciples basically say, well, they try to get him off the subject by talking about the temple. Oh, look at the stones and whatnot. And he says, every stone's coming down. This place is going to be laid waste. And that's exactly what happened. The number that were imprisoned during this time were close to 100,000 people. That's a lot of people just that went into slavery, that were basically in prison. Over 1 million people were killed during this siege. 1 million people trapped in Jerusalem. For anyone who's been to Jerusalem, if you can imagine 1 million people, 1 million people killed in that city, in that little area, without modern warfare, is astronomical. It must have stank. This large number during the siege was due to the Passover celebration, as the Jews from many countries had been in the city for the festival when the siege began. And this is Josephus, War of the Jews, Book 6, Chapter 9, Paragraph 3, line 420 through 22. Absolutely horrific event that took place. See, your house is laid to you, laid waste. Hear, O earth, see, I'm bringing evil upon this people, even the fruit of their thoughts, because they have not listened to my words, nor my Torah. They have rejected it. And this is the fruits of when you disobey. You're going into exile at best. If not, you're going to suffer death. Titus actually, normally you would get they would get these wreaths of victory, and Titus rejected it, saying basically there's no merit in basically conquering and vanquishing a people forsaken by their own Elohim. That he didn't even accept that. That's how bad this was. They were just totally Elohim forsaken. Now, here's what Josephus has to say about the matter, because he was an eyewitness to this. Matter of fact, they thought he almost killed him once, got hit in the head and knocked unconscious and a whole bunch of other stuff. I shall therefore speak my mind here at once briefly, that neither did any other city suffer such miseries, nor did any age ever breed a generation more fruitful in wickedness than this was, from the beginning of the world. Sodom and Gomorrah could not even light a candle compared to what was going on in Messiah's day. That's how wicked that generation was. Most people are not aware what that generation was like, but we don't have time to go into every single quote, but I just want to let you know that generation was judged for not... And they had plenty of signs and wonders that happened, which we'll talk about here real briefly. But I want to mention something. There's something very significant about the date that all these events happened. You remember back in the Torah when Moses sent out the 12 spies and only 2 came back with a good report? That happened on a very specific day, the 9th day of the 5th month. They didn't have faith. They didn't believe the word, and they couldn't go into the promised land because of that for 40 years. Well, the first temple was destroyed on the 9th day of the 5th month. Why? Because they didn't have faith and they did not obey. So they were sent into exile. The northern house actually was sent earlier in the Assyrian captivity, but the southern house was sent into Babylonian captivity, and the house of Yahuwah was destroyed. The second temple was destroyed on the 9th day of the 5th month in 70 CE. This is the fruit of disbelief and disobedience all the way through. That you cannot stay in Yah's house if you're not going to have faith and you're not going to obey. He won't tolerate it. And matter of fact, we looked last time at the whole temple was supposed to bear the name of Yahuwah, and they had polluted it with the things they were doing. And he had to destroy. They were misrepresenting his name. He had to get them out of the land, and he had to do away with these things. But he was setting up something new in the earth, and that's kind of what we're going to get into. I want to go one more slide before we, maybe 2 more, then we'll take a little pause here. But this is a really fascinating part, and if it wasn't actually recorded by multiple historians, Josephus, Eusebius, and a couple Roman historians, I would not bring this up because you're going to think this is sci-fi. But there were signs and wonders that were unbelievable that happened before the temple was destroyed in 70 CE. There was a comet over the city a time before the destruction of the city for a full year. there was a star formation in the shape of a sword over the city. There was a red heifer, or a red cow, and there's a lot more with this story. I'm going to just kind of cut it short here, that was going up to be sacrificed. Normally you don't take a pregnant cow, by the way. The cow gave birth to a lamb. I hope you heard me. The red heifer gave birth to a lamb. It's recorded by Josephus, Eusebius, and a whole bunch of other people. It's absolutely mind-boggling. These are signs. And basically what I think is a sign of, that would have been the 10th red heifer, which that's significant with Messiah. And they couldn't obviously sacrifice that. They wanted to do it before the destruction, and a lamb came forth. Basically saying the lamb was the 10th red heifer. That they missed it. So anyways, the eastern gates of the city would open on their own accord. And these were massive gates at night. They didn't understand what was going on. They would just open on their own accord. There was one event where they heard during, I think it was the Feast of Weeks, during Shavuot, a voice from the inside the dwelling place, let us go out from here. In one of the festivals at nighttime, it's shown, basically it got real bright like day for a half an hour, they record. These are major events. Then there was another event that kind of was really shocking too, where they saw chariots of fire in the sky rolling around in the heavens. There's a lot of these recorded. It's absolutely quite amazing. And if they weren't recorded actually in history, I wouldn't even bring them up. But the historians have made note of them, that it was quite, as they look back, they know they were omens, kind of like saying, hey, get things right. And there's actually scriptures that kind of tie into all these. We don't have got time to go into them, but when we come back here, after taking a little break, we're going to look again at the remnant. And I'm going to read this last verse here. Therefore I tell you that the kingdom of Elohim shall be taken away from you and given to people who will produce its fruits. And that's what we saw in Acts 2. And what we just covered. The kingdom was being taken away from those who had it, and it was given to the remnant. That's why Messiah had the 12, which is the sign of the government authority. Him being the king, the 70. He was establishing his government on the earth. That's what he was doing. It wasn't a new religion. It wasn't the birthday of, the church. It was the conclusion of the Feast of Weeks. It was an anniversary of when the Torah was given. And now this time the Spirit was coming. That those who would worship him in spirit and in truth. So we're going to take a short break, but we're going to come back. We're going to continue looking at the remnant.